everybody. Happy Saturday. Today we are jumping back to an episode that was inspired by a trip I took to Epcot. But don't worry if you're not into theme park things. It is in no way about anything Disney.
Nope. It is about the origins of the Phoenician alphabet and how that filled a communication gap for merchants when it was invented.
So let's just hop right in.
Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class from HowStuffWorks.com.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And today we're talking about a piece of history that touches most people, and probably most people that are listening to this podcast in English.
Yes.
But it also touches many other languages, and that is the Phoenician alphabet. And it actually, I was inspired to research this a little bit because last time I was in Epcot and I was riding Spaceship Earth, which for anyone who doesn't know, that big geodesic sphere in the middle of the front of the park that's kind of their icon. There's actually a ride in that. It's a very gentle and calm, but air conditioned, which is important.
And you get to sit down for a while.
Ride, yes, through sort of the history of man and how we've evolved communications and our communication methods. And the ride broke down as we were just adjacent to the Phoenician trader ship. And it was an unusually long breakdown. So for like 15 to 20 minutes, I just kept hearing over and over Dame Judi Dench saying, "Remember how easy it was to learn your ABCs? Thank the Phoenicians. They invented them." So after you hear that 100 times, you start to think you should thank the Phoenicians and do some research. And that is how we landed here.
I'm sort of imagining you in a no TV and no beer make home or something moment inside of Spaceship Earth.
Well, to be fair, I really do love that ride, and I love watching the animatronics, and I kind of enjoy it. Mm-hmm. But it did sort of eventually bore into my brain and make me want to do some more research. So just for a little background on the Phoenicians, Phoenicia was situated on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, so along the coast of modern-day Syria and Palestine, and including the lands of modern-day Lebanon. But they were pretty coastal. Their actual land wasn't very expansive, which is likely why they turned to the sea and life as merchants for most of their income and sort of well-being.
So while today the Phoenicians may be known most for their alphabet, they innovated in other ways as well.
And one of my favorites is they knew how to make purple dye, which most people who have studied history at all know is kind of a huge deal. It's a big textile advancement. They were actually known for making some pretty impressive textiles. And the earliest example of their production of this so-called royal purple, which was a dye that was actually worth more than its weight in gold, was found in the excavations of the 13th century BCE levels of the Phoenician city of Sarepta in Lebanon. And incidentally, and related to this, we don't really know what the Phoenicians called themselves. The name is actually Greek in origin, and it's believed to signify the color purple-red that they were known for making, which is kind of interesting.
So the dye was so important, they named a whole people after it.
Yeah, it was a huge part of their culture that was one of the things they had innovated.
Some accounts even credit the Phoenicians with the discovery of glassmaking.
And I read a few different versions of how that was discovered, which is why I qualify it as some accounts. Mm-hmm. They did make glass, but whether they actually discovered it or picked it up and then refined it, some historians argue about.
Yeah, I should have asked the boyfriend.
Oh yeah, because he's a pro at,
yes,
at how these things come to be.
He has a degree in glass science.
Yeah. Ask him and we'll get back to that one. But they were also really great shipmakers and sailors. And according to legend, one of their greatest sort of accomplishments in terms of seafaring was at the request of the Egyptian king Necho II, and they circumnavigated Africa in 600 BCE, which is huge. I mean, that's it's a
very long voyage
journey. And most accounts suggest that they actually stopped at one point and made land and lived on the land for a little while and got some crops going to sort of refill the boats.
Yeah, it seems like some sort of restocking would have been necessary just for what it takes to support people on a boat.
Yeah, and in 2008, there was a reproduction built of a Phoenician ship, and it actually sailed the same course. And that's like a 20,000-mile voyage, so that's long. And it took that modern vessel 2 years. So presumably you would have run out of supplies in a 2-year period.
Yeah.
And would have had to restock. There are actually some historians who suspect that the Phoenicians traveled all the way to North America, although that is argued in history circles.
It's a controversial idea.
Yeah. There's a March 2013 CNN article about the possibility, and in it, they interviewed geology professor Dr. Mark McMenamin of Mount Holyoke College, and he mentions that there are actually Phoenician coins that are inscribed with maps of the Old and New Worlds, which supports this idea that they did, in fact, make it to the Americas at some point. And the same group that recreated that circumnavigation of Africa is currently raising funds to sail that same ship across the Atlantic and try to see if that was truly possible. Because unlike where they went around Africa and they could kind of pull in and stop, there's nowhere to pull in. There's no rest stop between there and here.
Yeah, the idea of going across.
They could find islands, but that's kind of a little bit of a long shot.
Yeah. Well, and the idea of going across the whole Atlantic Ocean in a little tiny boat is kind of terrifying to me.
It's not so tiny. It's certainly not a cruise ship, but
no.
It's
yeah, if I'm traveling across the whole Atlantic, I kind of want there to be,
a floating city,
lifeboats, and a safety drill before we leave.
Yeah.
About how to get into the lifeboats.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, I haven't read a lot about this particular plan, but I'm sure they have support crew always at the ready, because they are hooked up to like GPS and stuff.
Yeah. They traded all over the Mediterranean and parts beyond, and their culture is recognized as the first real globalized business.
Which is pretty cool. And about the alphabet. So prior to this alphabet, the Phoenicians were using a cuneiform script, just like the rest of Mesopotamia was.
The roots of the Phoenician alphabet are in the 15th century BCE in what's sometimes referred to as the Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic alphabet. The earliest examples of Phoenician writing date back to 1200 BCE, and they are inscriptions found in the city of Byblos.
And it is no accident that biblos is also the root word for bibliothèque and Bible.
And bibliography.
Exactly. All of the book-related words. If you were to look at a linguistic family tree of alphabets, Phoenician would be really close to the base. And because the Phoenicians traded with so many other cultures, their form of written communication spread really quickly and really widely. Most other alphabets can actually be traced back to the Phoenician alphabet. So the direct descendants of it include Aramaic, Etruscan, Archaic Greek, Old Hebrew, and Proto-Arabic. And there is also even some influence in Indian and East Asian language.
Only consonants are represented in the Phoenician alphabet. There are no vowels. This is also called an abjad alphabet.
It made me think of, when I was researching it, when you see people's license plates that just have, a very reduced version of a word and you have to kind of fill in the vowels.
Yeah.
Because initially I was like, how did that work? But that was kind of my modern ticket into how that might function.
Or old real estate listings from before the internet, when you only had so many column inches in the newspaper.
And there are actually only 22 letters. And those letters can be traced back to hieroglyphs in many cases. So their form, and even there's often in some historical accounts kind of a flowchart of how, like, this word for ox turned into this shape, which turned into this letter, which has similar sound or whatever. So it was born of these other things, but it filled a void of sound-based alphabet.
Generally, Phoenician was written from right to left, but in some instances it was written in a Busterfeden style, which means that it would alternate direction. One line would be written from right to left and the next from left to right. The alternating direction would continue, so somebody reading the language could read their way down a passage of text without ever having to jump visually to the start of a new line, which as a child, I just wondered why that was not how we did it.
Well, it has been tried.
Apparently.
But mostly Phoenician to the best of my knowledge, does go from right to left, and you do have to do the jump just like we do in our left to right reading of English. There were also not normally spaces between words, which seems a little bit crazy, I think, to the modern mind. But there were sometimes dots to distinguish words, and sometimes there were vertical slashes, like a vertical stroke. But eventually, spaces did come into play. And by the 6th century BCE, spaces were becoming more common than the dots or the vertical strokes to create word separation.
The Phoenician numeral system was also written from right to left, and it bears a resemblance to the Roman numeral system. It combines symbols to create complex numbers, a lot like Roman numerals do.
Yeah. And much of the Old Testament was originally written down using the Phoenician alphabet because there weren't really any other options in the way of a standardized writing system at the time that was an actual alphabet and not pictogram.
So why did the Phoenicians want to create an alphabet in the first place?
There is a very short answer for this.
Bookkeeping.
Yes. They were trading. Roman scholar Pliny the Elder is credited with defining the Phoenicians as the first traveling salesmen. And Pliny the Elder gets a little bit of a grain of salt with anything you read. He was apparently given to exaggeration, and he was very, very pro-Phoenician. Like, he really admired that culture. But it is pretty widely accepted that he was accurate in this characterization of them, because they were traveling all over the place, and their entire culture was really based on trade.
So as we mentioned, they traveled all over the Mediterranean and maybe even the globe. The goal of the new alphabet was to create a system that would be easy to learn and understand by their business associates. And before this, written communication had been pretty pictogram-based. It was so diversified that different societies could not share written information and have everyone know what the symbols meant. So the Phoenicians found this way to break words down into characters with different sounds that could be combined to create any number of words. Because this was a written codification of sound instead of pictograms, it was easily adaptable to multiple languages.
And because this alphabet was invented to record and track trades, the alphabet itself sort of became traded. It was the language of business transactions, but it also got adopted for general use because it filled this void of systemized writing that was, again, not pictogram based, that people could pick up pretty easily.
Yeah, and that lets you more easily transliterate other languages.
Exactly.
Cadmus the Phoenician is giving credit for introducing the alphabet of his people to the Greeks, as told in the writings of Herodotus.
And Herodotus says, the Phoenicians who came with Cadmus introduced into Greece, after their settlement in the country, a number of accomplishments, of which the most important was writing, an art till then, I think, unknown to the Greeks. At first, they used the same characters as all the other Phoenicians, but as time went on and they changed their language, they also changed the shape of their letters. At that period, most of the Greeks in the neighborhood were Ionians. They were taught these letters by the Phoenicians and adopted them, with a few alterations for their own use, continuing to refer to them as the Phoenician characters, as was only right as the Phoenicians had introduced them. So even though it had evolved, they still attributed its the alphabet to the Phoenicians.
We should point out that even though this was a defined writing system, there were variations on the alphabet in different Phoenician colonies. Cypro-Phoenician, Sardinian, and the Punic and Neo-Punic, which is the cursive version of Punic versions found in Carthage. The Carthage versions of the alphabets continued to be used until about the 3rd century CE.
And with the development of this new written alphabet also came new ways of writing, so it kind of catalyzed a whole new age of communication. Wax tablets came into being where they could imprint letters into the wax. Pens, ink, papyrus, parchment, and eventually paper kind of all came from this development. So it was a very rapid growth element in the world of communication.
In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great put Phoenicia under Greek control. And then in 146 BCE, Rome demolished Carthage after pursuing Hannibal there after the Second Punic War, and what was left of Phoenicia became part of the Roman Empire.
And ironically, very few instances of Phoenician writings actually remain. The papyrus that they often wrote on and some of those early forms of paper has really not survived terribly well. What we know mostly is from other cultures writing about how awesome the Phoenicians were and about their alphabet and its development. The oldest surviving Phoenician writing example, which we briefly mentioned earlier, is in Byblos, and it's on the sarcophagus of King Ahriam, and it's dated at approximately 1200 BCE. And most of what we know, like I said, has actually come from the writings of the Greeks. So even though the Phoenicians have there's a little bit of a shroud of lack of information around them from them, other cultures wrote about them enough that we know about them.
Yes.
Which is really cool.
So now if you're stuck in Spaceship Earth, you'll know.
Thank the Phoenicians. They invented them. Also, the way that Dame Judi Dench says that is so charming that I will never, ever forget it. It's pretty awesome.
It's because Dame Judi Dench is awesome.
Yeah, she is. Prior to her, it was Walter Cronkite that narrated that ride, but then they updated it a few years back, and she took it over and did a beautiful job.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Saturday Classic. Since this is out of the archive, if you heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar during the course of the show, that may be obsolete now. So here is our current contact information. We are at historypodcast@howstuffworks.com, and then we're at Missed in History all over social media. That is our name on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. Thanks again for listening.
For more on this and thousands of other topics, visit howstuffworks.com.